And here's one final example that shows you really how you can push this Cinema 4D render engine pretty far inside of After Effects. Now this single loop took an hour to render and it's only 4 seconds long, so prepare yourself for that. But this is using that exact same technique of extruding out that text in a very smooth way and then just making a bunch of duplicates. The way that I made these duplicates was by taking the shape layer that made up the Skillshare logo and adding an offset operator so that the paths expanded out. And I had to combine that with a merge paths operator. If we take a look in here, this is a very render intensive project, so I'm going to turn on Draft 3D and Fast Draft. And that's going to eliminate all of the shading so it looks completely flat. But if I just solo these one at a time, here's my Skillshare logo and here's my first outline of that logo. So let's just look at that one. You see that there's actually a hole inside where that logo would be. If I turn Draft 3D off, it'll be more apparent. So we got the standard logo and then we've got this hole punched out inside. So the way I made this was by going into the group for all of the shapes. I have two groups called Offset and Offset 2 and then a Merge Paths. So let me just turn off the Merge Paths so we can see what's happening here. If I turn the second offset off, I have just the standard logo on the inside. Nothing is being adjusted from the original logo there. And then I have the Offset 2, which is where I actually do have an Offset Paths that's pushing this out a certain distance. And I actually linked that up to a slider control just so I could modify this more quickly outside of digging through all of these contents of the layers. But it's just pushing the paths outwards. Once I had that group set up, I had to make the second copy of that logo without any offset. So really this should be called Logo and Offset. And then used a Merge Paths to exclude the intersections. So it's punching a hole there, making room for the original unedited version of the logo. And then I just continued to duplicate and offset that layer over and over again until I got it to fill up the entire frame. And if I press U to bring up the keyframes, we can see that the animation is all just offset in time. So it's extruding the text upwards and then coming back downwards. And I smoothed all this out using the graph editor. So it's just a nice kind of sine wave motion that gives this really hypnotic kind of feel to the entire animation. And for the camera, I just had a really zoomed in lens that was far away to get rid of a lot of the perspective and compress the depth of field, and then just slowly pushed in and kind of rotated the camera a little bit as well. Now you'll notice that this final render does look different than what we're looking at here, and it's not just because I have Draft 3D turned on. It's because I actually rendered this sequence out because one frame took so long to render. If I turn my quality back to final, you can see that it's taking a long time to even start rendering one frame. So I'm going to just save my machine some trouble and turn that back down to Fast Draft and just say that I did export this from this state first, and then I made a new composition that's my final render composition, and I brought that final render into here. Now it's not currently set up that way because I'm not going to be giving you that giant render file to download. So instead, the actual pre-comp with that animation is just plugged into here, but then inside of this comp I added my effects. It's the same process every time. I added in some unsharp mask, some color correction, some grain, and the optics compensation to give a little bit of distortion around the outside edges. I added in a vignette, but I also have this depth map. And that is what's blurring out the edges of this scene. If I go to that animation comp, you see that there's an effect called camera lens blur applied. This is a pretty advanced effect, but the way that it works is basically blurring out your image or your composition based on brightness values. And that's contained within what's called a depth map. So that's what this composition is right here. If I double click on it, it's just a really big square composition with a gradient from white to black to white again. The way that you can think of this depth map is anything that's pure black is in focus. There's no blurring at all. Everything that's pure white has the maximum amount of blur that you set the effect to, and everything in between from white to black gets gradually less and less blurry. So I put this at an angle, brought it into my render comp. If we turn it on, see that it's just placed in the comp and then disabled. because the effect of this camera lens blur just needs to reference that layer. It doesn't need to actually see it. So I went into the effect to the blur map and chose my depth map as the layer to use for the blurring. And I made sure that my channel was set to luminance, the luminosity from black to white. And then it applied a blur based on the settings that I had set up here to that entire layer using that gradient. And it makes for a very realistic camera blur. Like I said, this is very advanced and you can use it with 3D renders from actual 3D programs to add in depth of field after the fact, and that saves you a lot of time when rendering out of, say, Cinema 4D. And I'm basically treating my Cinema 4D comp the exact same way. I'm just getting my 3D geometry, lighting, and camera movement all set up in this comp. I exported that so that it didn't have to constantly render every single frame, and then brought it into this render comp, or the final composite, to add in color correction, the effects, and that camera blur. And that's one way that you can really push this Cinema 4D render engine inside of After Effects to make really nice looking motion graphics without actually having to leave the program.